All right, I've got 10 o'clock on the dot, so we will get started. For those that don't know who I am, my name is Anderson Brooms. I'm the GIS program manager for the State of Alabama 911 Board. With us today are, and forgive me, and Becca, I should know your titles by now, but I don't. Annie Cahill is the State of Alabama Client Success Manager. Is that correct, Annie?
Sure, we can go with that. That's one of my titles.
Sorry.
Sounds good.
4
Sounds
years
good
in,
to me.
you think I would know. And Becca Mangan, the GIS technical lead for DATAMARK.
Yes.
This is a bit different than what we normally do to Talk About It Tuesday. We have to frame this in the Talk About It Tuesday window because we get pretty consistent participation in this time slot. But this is unlike the other Talk About It Tuesdays that you norm or are used to attending. This is more of an educational / training session and a prelude to both the statewide data remediation project as well as in-person training you will be receiving at a location coming near you. And I don't want to step on Annie and Becca's toes, and I'll let them jump right in, but they're going to talk about the remediation project, what it means to you, what the expectations for you as a ECD will be in being a partner with DATAMARK and the State Board Office. And then, like I said, I'll fill in any holes I feel like need to be filled in after they give their presentation. So without further ado, Annie and Becca, the floor is yours.
Great. Annie, you want me to just go through, or
Yeah, that's fine.
I'll click through and you can talk. How about that?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I would appreciate if because there's some names in here. I know who a lot of you are, but if you guys could just drop in the chat who you are, what ECD you're from. It would really also help us to know if you're kind of like new to your position, so we know how deep to go. And we welcome all questions too. So while we're talking, feel free to drop some questions in the chat because we will be, answering those in the chat and then also through the course of our presentation here. So as Anderson mentioned, I'm Annie Cahill. I'm a technical consultant with DATAMARK. I am also the client success manager for the state of Alabama. And Becca, you can go ahead and say hi.
Hi, yes, I'm Becca Mangan. I'm the technical manager for really Alabama, majority of the Alabama projects that we support. So I help oversee and support a team of GIS professionals to execute the services, the contracts.
Yeah, and I know that we've met a lot of you and talked to a lot of you. We did want to talk to you today about this project that we have going on with the state and within digital. So we're going to kind of go through and we're going to talk about kind of like an intro to NG 911 today, because I know that there are some folks who might be a little bit newer. I know personally I've had, I spoke to a few people at the conference in October who were new to their roles. So I want to make sure everybody kind of understands what's going on and why we're doing this initiative. And then I'm going to turn it over to Anderson to talk about kind of like the current state of things in Alabama. We have a good timeline that he provided, as well as a screenshot with the aggregation dashboard. We're going to talk about the project that we're doing within digital and kind of what our process is, as well as we're going to go through the deliverable that you guys are going to get from this project and any upcoming trainings that are going to be coming next year. We were going to try to shoot for one in December, but they're going to be calendar year 2025. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so the purpose of NG 911, why are we doing this? I know that a lot of you are kind of past this, but again, this is really a refresher for the folks who may not understand the intent and purpose of NG 911, because as GIS people, I feel like we really want to know the why. And this is a really good kind of foundation for why we're doing what we're doing, not just the data cleanup, but then also going into why we're doing the project that we're doing within digital, and what does that mean for our data? What does that mean for us as GIS folks? And if you've been in any of my presentations, you've heard me refer to us as geospatial first responders. If we're managing data for NG 911, we are geospatial first responders, right? And the reason is because before anybody picks up a telephone in the 911 center, the GIS data is being used to route that call into the appropriate PSAP. This is about NG 911 call routing. That's what the whole purpose of this effort is for. It is different than CAD. A lot of you are using different CAD systems throughout the state, and certainly we're aware and sensitive to those needs. But first and foremost, the project is about call routing into the appropriate 911 center. So currently, calls are being routed through a series of tables that are owned by telephone companies, and those are the MSAG and ALI tables. If you have any type of GIS background, you're looking at these databases and you're like, oh, that looks kind of like an attribute table. Yes, it does. So essentially, your MSAG is going to have your street name, it's going to have a high and low, have community information, ESN value. There's lots of information that's associated in your MSAG and in your ALI. The problem is that these databases are notoriously inaccurate. They do have a lot of errors, and the locals don't always own these. It's very rare. I would say the people who own their MSAG is like the exception and not the norm. It's a very uncommon thing that we've seen. So that poses a lot of challenges, because if you want to make corrections to your MSAG, you're providing updates to the telephone company, but they're not true updates, right? It's really a suggestion, and they can decide whether to accept or reject it. This was a big point of conversation when I was in New Mexico earlier this year, because I had two people who were in two counties sitting side by side, and they said, look, I can submit my changes and it goes through right away. Whereas the other person says, every time I submit a change or a suggestion, it always gets rejected, or it takes them days to accept it. So this is the problem with an in-house, when you're managing GIS data in-house, but then you're relying on telephone company to maintain that data that's routing your call. So let's go to the next slide. Did it advance, Becca? Oh.
I don't know if that was me, but you cut out, but it could be on my end. I think
yeah, well, I'm using. Okay.
So is this where you want slide?
Yeah, this is fine.
Okay.
All right. So the whole thing currently in 911, like if you're using, GIS historically in 911, has always been for reference, right? Like it's, oh, let's get a map and we can, draw out our, response boundaries, or we can draw out, X boundary, and we can display it in the 911 center, but it's not actually doing a function. It's just a reference, right? And so historically we've had these address points and road center lines, and the data largely has not been standardized for regular 911. Okay, yeah, you have an address, but it might be parsed into different fields or all into one field. Maybe we would call that concatenation. That's a nerd speak for everything is managed in one field. But having a national standard for NG 911 means that the data has to be structured a specific way, right? So we're also familiar with ESZs. I'm sure you guys are very well aware of what your ESZs are. So that's the data that's commonly used today. Now, you guys probably use other stuff like, aerial imagery. You might have other data sets that you use like trails and so forth. But these are the main ones that we see consistently utilized in 911. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to pretend like I know how to explain this, and I don't. All right, so this is spaghetti, and this is a very oversimplified version of NG 911. So essentially, it's going to be a forklift overhaul of the entire 911 system, hardware, software, and call taking equipment. And by the way, guys, if you have any questions or comments about this, you can drop those in the chat if you have access to the Zoom chat, and we'll keep an eye on that as we're talking through things. But anyway, all of that is being replaced by the EZNet, and that's where your GIS data lives to perform these functions. So you kind of hear this this phrase, "Oh, the MSAG is going away." Yeah, kind of. I would say nationwide, it really just depends. The MSAG and ALI are still very important right now, but I think Anderson, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys wanted to move totally away from MSAG and ALI by the end of 25. Is that correct?
But that's the goal through this project as well, is in the, I think the key terminology is that not that the MSAG is going away, but it will be a GIS derived MSAG.
Yeah, and that's important because, you know, a lot of people think that because that has been a very common phrase that's been tossed around, at least in the 6-ish years that I've been involved in next gen stuff. The problem there is that a lot of people don't. Yeah, geo MSAG. That's right, Scott. You're right. Yeah, so it's more of a geo MSAG. Your MSAG is still super important. And if you actually look at the data model, and when we refer to the data model, we're talking about the National Emergency Number Association GIS data model. So that data model is really responsible for the structure, showing the structure of the data, like what layers are required, what is the structure of those layers, meaning what are the attributes that need to be carried within each feature class. That's what we're talking about when we're referring to like a schema or the data model. It's like, okay, we have our core layers that are required, and then within each of those layers, you have to have specific fields that are populated. And within that data model, if you look at the road center lines and the address points, we have what are called legacy fields. And the legacy fields are incredibly important to keep that tie back to your MSAG. So we don't want to look at the MSAG as like a lesser, non-important thing. Both are very important. You need to make sure that they're both answering the same questions. So this is the time when we're synchronizing those things and we're holding them both to the same standards, right? So they both need to answer the same questions. They both should reflect the same information. So the MSAG is not going away. It's just kind of evolving into something else. So let's go to the next slide. So a lot of people believe if they're text 911, then they're NG 911. No, that's not true. Texting information is one piece of information that is part of NG 911. Again, it's about the hardware, software, call taking equipment. It's the entire infrastructure that's being overhauled. It's transitioning the call routing from databases that are owned by the telephone company to the locality's GIS data. So all of these things that you see on this screen will be consumed as part of the 911 call through NG 911. And that's what makes it so important, because we have over 80% of 911 calls that come into call centers from mobile devices, right? And so that's a huge consideration. And we have to think about that when we're upgrading and moving things over. So all of these things will be a part of the 911 call going forward after, you know, everything is fully implemented. So let's go to the next screen there, Becca. So the LVF and the ECRF are going to be responsible for location validation and the emergency call routing. So what the LVF does is it actually validates location information. It's really going to be the new MSAG, and any location errors, like it says, are going to be reported to the data authority. And this is kind of taking place on the InDigital side. So when you move your GIS data to InDigital, when all of that is provisioned, you're going to be notified if there's any errors within your data through that discrepancy agency ID field within the data model. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. But just know that there is another set of checks and balances that your data is going to have to go through once it goes up to InDigital. And any anomalies that are identified through their validation process are going to be identified based on that discrepancy agency ID that is located within the GIS data. And it's carried with every single feature, not like one road, right? Because one road could have 27 segments. if you're, breaking them at cross streets as you should be doing for good data management. So you would have an individual discrepancy agency ID for every single feature on a road center line, for example. So if you have 27 segments of Main Street, you're going to have 27 unique IDs. And the reason for this is because, as we found in DATAMARK, like we have Escambia County, Alabama, we have Escambia County, Florida, and you hear this saying that every town has a Main Street or something like that. There are so many duplicative county names across the United States. Remember that the idea of NG911 is about a network of networks. So it's not just about your city, it's not just about your county or your town, or even just about the state of Alabama. It's about an entire interconnected network across the United States, so that, like, I live in Virginia, Becca lives in California. If one of our PSAPs fail, then one of your guys' PSAPs could route our 911 calls, right? So that's the whole purpose of having a truly unique ID that's tied to every single feature in your GIS, so that it can differentiate one Escambia from another. Okay, one Main Street from Escambia to another Main Street in Escambia. That's the whole purpose of that. So we can go to the next slide and talk about the ECRF. So the ECRF is really about determining the correct PSAP, right? It's saying, okay, you are located in this PSAP, so that's where we're going to route you. It's a total paradigm shift in how we're routing calls today. So we're doing what's called geospatial call routing. And what that means is that we're looking at the GIS data when the call comes in, and we're saying, oh, okay, the call is coming from this particular address. In the case of what we would call a civic location, which is a structure that has a landline, we're saying, oh, here's the address point for this, and it's located in this PSAP by looking at the GIS data. If it's coming through on a mobile device, it's going to look at the location information provided with that mobile device and say, oh, okay, we're going to validate it against that PSAP, and then that's where it's going to route that call. So one is about location validation, and the other is about routing the call to the correct PSAP. And that's really the foundation of NG911. So if you can take anything away from this, it's that it's incredibly important going forward for GIS and anybody, for not only for GIS data managers, but also whoever's managing your ECD. You have the responsibility, the very important responsibility, to provide the most accurate and complete GIS data that you can possibly provide to InDigital. Otherwise, you can have issues with your call routing. Okay, it is the most important GIS that you will ever do. That's what I always tell people, because our GIS data has been asked to do something that it's never had to do before, with a level of accuracy and completeness that it's never had to have before. And you guys are very blessed in the state of Alabama to have such fantastic leadership guiding you through this process, because believe me, I have seen it in other states where some people don't even understand this initiative at all. And you guys are so far ahead. And I think that, you should give Anderson a big high five the next time you see him, because he's really doing a great job in helping you guys get to where you need to be. So I guess I'll pause here and ask, maybe you guys can drop in the chat if you have any questions. And then Anderson, I'll turn it over to you to talk to us about what our timeline has been in the state of Alabama, and then what is the current state. Frank, you have your hand raised. Go for it. You might have to come off mute, sir. Or if you want to drop in the chat, you can. Or was that a high five? I don't know. It's weird in a chat. You never know. Okay. Well, I'll turn it over to Anderson if you guys don't have any questions.
Thank you, Annie. I guess we can, there we go, cool. So I presented these next couple slides at the Gulf Coast Conference for the first time, and it really is just an overview of the last 4-ish years and our journey to NG911 GIS data readiness. And Annie summed it up very well in terms of why we're here today having this conversation about the GIS and what we are doing moving forward. So way back pre-COVID days of August 2019, the state of Alabama was awarded $4.2 million in federal grant money for NG911 data readiness, all things, NG911. And fortunately, at that time, we were well on our way to a fully realized and built out EZNet that we affectionately call ANGIN, Alabama Next Generation 911 Network. So we were able to really focus that federal grant money over the performance period of the next 2 years for GIS data readiness, which fortunately for me led to my hire in March of 2020 as the GIS program manager, you know and love today, right? The first thing I was tasked with in March of 2020 was reading 400-ish page proposals for, excuse me, a GIS vendor for NG911 data readiness, which led to oral arguments that did not take place in person because of COVID, which was really weird. In fact, we signed a contract with DATAMARK without me ever physically meeting an employee of DATAMARK in October of 2020, which led to coming out of the fall of 2020, actually meeting some DATAMARK employees, which was nice. But we, during the onboarding process, realized that, excuse me, that we needed some help getting districts' GIS data formatted into the VEP, which is, for those that don't know, DATAMARK's proprietary core services product. Validate, edit, and provision is what it stands for. It is, in simplistic terms, a data sniffer. We'll get into that later, but the data has to be in a certain format, and we realized districts didn't have the bandwidth or the GIS resources to convert that data, and so we entered into what we affectionately called the data modification agreement, which was the handing off of the GIS data to DATAMARK to get the schema into the format VEP knows. For those old hats that have been around for 4 years, you'll remember fondly the gap 1 and gap 2 analysis that was like pulling teeth to have to sit through to understand why your data needed to be in a format. By June of 2021, we'd had enough districts onboarded into VEP, and again, going back to those federal grant dollars, began spending some of those federal grant dollars to remediate GIS data into an NG911 state. Those projects varied in scope and tenor from data creation to data modification and lasted well over a year into 2022. In October of 2021, and Digital came to us, and this was really our first application, for lack of a better term, into utilizing GIS for NG911 applications for geo-routing. We are now statewide geo-routing, but at the time it was a brand new concept to us. And we started in Jefferson County because the two highest transfers consistently board meeting to board meeting, so every other month, was Jefferson County to Birmingham and Birmingham to Jefferson County. By January of 2022, we had proof of concept that geo-routing was functional, and we saw a 40% reduction in transfers both ways over Birmingham to Jefferson, Jefferson to Birmingham. So by March of 22, we knew we had a functional NG911 element, and I don't want to take away from what we are doing, but it is still what we consider transitional geo-routing, but nonetheless functional geo-routing, which led to us beginning the PSAP boundary collection and gap and overlap remediation. Back up, next slide, please. A big milestone for the program was by May of 2022, so about 2 years into my tenure here, we had successfully collected, onboarded, and provisioned to VEP 85 districts GIS data, the 7 pertinent air quotes layers, road center lines, address points, PSAP boundary, provisioning boundary, and the 3 emergency response boundaries for every district statewide. That was a big deal for us. The next month, the probably the biggest milestone in the program's history was Nita Jackson was hired to assist districts with their GIS data editing needs. Along the same time, we completed what we call the ACE project. Annie, what does the ACE acronym stand for? Please refresh my memory.
Address comparison evaluation, I think.
Thank
Right?
you. So I don't want to get too off in the weeds about that, but in essence, what the ACE project did was identified potentially, and that's a critical word in this, potentially over 650,000 missing address points statewide from what the address data layer in VEP had. So distilled down to its essence, the ACE project examines the GIS address point layer and compares it to known external address databases. And where the external address databases have an address that is not in the master GIS address database, it identifies those missing addresses as potential address candidates. The more times it hit an external address database, the more likely it is to be a missing address point in the master database. This is pretty critical for the scope of this conversation and project, in that we have delivered a number of ACE deliverables to districts. If you have not yet received your ACE, part of the deliverables coming out of this remediation project is the ACE deliverable. So by the end of the remediation project, which has a target date of December 2025, all districts statewide will receive their ACE deliverable. And we can talk about that. We'll talk about that more individually as we do kickoffs, remediation meeting, and then the remediation deliverables. So by December of 2022, we had identified nearly 6,000 gaps and overlaps in the VEP uploaded PSAP boundary, and began a statewide project to facilitate remediating those gaps and overlaps. This was identified over 4 regions, starting in the north, ending in the south, with I think it was a 3-month focus on meeting with districts and talking about where their gaps or overlaps were. We had great participation, but we did not have statewide participation. So what we did to deliver a gap and overlap, so topologically coincidental, real fancy words there, PSAP boundary, was the districts that came to the table and discussed with us and other collaborators, is what we call neighboring ECDs or PSAPs, where we had participation. We used that as the authoritative boundary and edged matched non-participatory ECDs or PSAPs with the remediation of the gaps and overlaps. So we now have a statewide PSAP boundary that is seamless, no gaps or overlaps, that in digital currently georoutes off of. Another big milestone in April of 2023. Oh, not quite ready for the slide switch yet, Becca. Thank you. Was the beginning of Rapid SOS Premium Portal. To date, I believe 97 of 106 statewide PSAPs have Rapid SOS Premium Portal. The role GIS plays in the Rapid SOS, it is the functional base map for the Rapid SOS. Given your authoritative road center line and address point GIS layers, it is the thing that you, the road center line and address points, the dots and lines, for lack of a better term, on your base map in Rapid SOS. More importantly, the addressing drives the geocoder for the location validation in the Rapid SOS Premium network. So it sniffs your address points first to give you a deliverable validated address in the Rapid SOS Premium portal. All right. Thank you, Becky. We can move on now. So again, by August of 2020, the premium installation begins. I believe by July of 2024, the Rapid SOS Premium is available for every district that has the availability to have an account. Like I said, I believe it was the last count, 96 or 97 PSAPs statewide out of 106. And for those that do not have premium activated today, it is one of 2 reasons. Either they never had an account, and apparently the establishment of an account takes 8 to 12 weeks sometimes, and that's not on anybody other than the Google and Apple carriers. That's just a function of how that process works. But by October of 2023, we completed the boundary facilitation project I spoke of, and georouting went live statewide. We spun up each district and did, for those that got to participate in the the enjoyable calls of testing georouting, we had tested it statewide and deployed it statewide. And also, another pretty big milestone, we signed our second contract with DATAMARK to renew services for, I believe, a 3-year period. One of the next major projects after statewide georouting was delivered was the identification that GIS-derived M-Saganally was on the horizon. And what that requires is synchronization between the M-Saganally. What's in the M-Saganally that's missing in the GIS? What's in the GIS that's missing in the M-Saganally? And the purpose of this is so that nothing really gets left behind when we finally make that conversion to GIS-derived M-Saganally. We have to make sure that the records match and coexist before we transition the way we maintain the M-Saganally. I believe it was in February of this year where the FCC put out its notice of location-based routing. And it distilled down to its essence, it basically said by the end of 2024, carriers are responsible for pre-routing a call based on the location of the cellular device. If Adam Brown is not on this call, he's probably cringing at the simplification of that, but that is how I understand that report and order. So we currently only have 2 carriers that I'm aware of that are pre-routing calls in the state of Alabama. That's T-Mobile and Comcast, I believe. Nonetheless, it does not impact what we do in georouting. We still take the call and georoute it, but if you're interested in more in that, we can have a side conversation about what that means for the ingress into the engine network. And I will fast forward to September of 2024 and really talk about why we are here today. We have been working within digital, again, the analogy I like to use is engine is the vehicle and the GIS is the engine that powers that vehicle. And a fully realized I3 compliant next generation 911 network. GIS works with the functional elements of an EZNet core services to deliver a call to the correct PSAP the first time, as well as do all the functional elements of NG911. I throw around the acronyms LVF, SI, ECRF, all the things that are NG911 core services. So we, over the last 6-ish months, have been working within digital to frankly build those core services out, the location validation function, the emergency call routing function, the spatial interface, all the things. The key component for you today, the takeaway, is that the GIS is at the center of all of those functional elements and drives their functionality. And so I would say 4 to 6 months ago, Digital came to us and said, okay, we are beta testing all these core services, and we have to have the GIS in a format that looks like X, Y, and Z. So we took that written document, delivered it to DATAMARK, and said, what does this mean in terms of VEP validations? And DATAMARK came back to us and said, we have identified 26 sub-validations within the broader 120, 140 validations that would render a fully compliant I3 GIS data model for a next generation 911 format. So we have taken that and produced a report that I call the data readiness report, and realized that of the 85 ECDs statewide, only 2 met out of the box the minimum data requirements for NG911 data readiness that Digital had identified. Coincidentally, one was Lamar County, who NETA has worked with very closely to remediate their data, and the other was Marengo County, who we contracted DATAMARK to build their data for them. So DATAMARK did a pretty good job of building that data set. All that to say, we identified that we had a long way to go to deliver a GIS data ready data set to Digital for next generation 911 core services. We knew we were behind the 8 ball on that. And so what we identified, or what we executed was a contract with DATAMARK to edit statewide all districts' GIS data to meet those in digital minimum requirements. This would level set equitably the GIS to a minimum standard that in digital has, for lack of a better term, basically said they cannot accept because it will not function the way they have designed their NG911 core services. So we have kicked that project off in August of this year, and currently 35 districts are either complete or in some iteration of remediation currently, with the other 50-ish districts to be completed between now and December of 2025. So I feel like I've been talking a lot. Annie, Becca, did I hit on anything, miss on anything?
That was great.
No. Yeah, that was great. And you kind of already discussed the project goals, which I was going to pass over to you anyway. But if there's anything else you want to mention on the timeline, Anderson, go
Not
for
unless
it.
anybody wants to hear me ramble some more. I think I touched it all.
All right.
You did.
I do want to take an opportunity real quick to point out Scott and the chat. Scott is one of the few, I think the only district that has done an independent ACE and then had their ACE delivered to him. And he says, 21,821 addresses of the 57,443 were identified as missing address points. So I do want to drive that point home a little bit. Like, an ACE deliverable gives you this master list of potential candidates of missing address points. And so I don't know what the math on that is, but close to 40% of the addresses that were identified in Baldwin County on the ACE deliverable were actually valid missing addresses in their master address database. So it's a very valuable tool, but I don't want to get off in the weeds. ACE is not the scope of this conversation today, but it's something we will deliver to your district and have a conversation about at another date and time.
Yeah. Did you guys have any questions about this timeline? Okay, and then I guess, Anderson, the next thing that we had that we wanted you to go over was the dashboard. So you sent us that screenshot of the dashboard. Would you like to review that with everybody?
Yeah, so this is a little bit dated, but the map is a little bit more up to date than this. So the point of this map is we have always had a mechanism to deliver GIS to InDigital, but it matters now because InDigital is utilizing the GIS data as the functional engine, for lack of a better term, to their core services. So up-to-date GIS data is critical to efficient functionality within the core services. The map I have shown in the past is last aggregated because the mechanism for which you send data from your local VEP instance into the statewide instance is called aggregation, but it's really a three-part system: upload, validate, aggregate. Everybody's heard me say it 1,000 times. Michelle kills it every time on the Talk About It Tuesdays. But even if you aggregate weekly, like do a scheduled aggregation, if you have not uploaded data, you are aggregating the last uploaded data. So if it's been 6 months since you uploaded data to the VEP, you can hit aggregate every month, every week, and the data is still old data. So I really have pressed DATAMARK to help me with their reporting about when's the last time a district uploaded, validated, and aggregated. And so what this map represents is what I'm calling the data recency map. The last time the GIS data was refreshed within the VEP. And so this is actually, like I say, a little bit out of date. The numbers are actually a lot better. Part of that is probably with the DATAMARK remediation projects. They are uploading, validating, and aggregating on a more cadenced schedule. So, if you're red on this map, the data in VEP is over 6 months old. And that, while we would like to see data, this map in my mind should be green statewide. We should have GIS data that's no more than a month old. You know, really green or yellow, I think, is considered recent GIS data. Orange or red is dated GIS data, and this is what sits in your VEP as it is today.
Okay. I don't know if there's any questions. I know this is kind of a frequent topic, but
so I believe it was Kirsty Nolter asked, when will InDigital and DATAMARK agree on what is provisioning and a PSAP boundary? And my answer to that is it doesn't matter to InDigital. The boundaries are separate but equal, and it is important to highlight the distinction on what the boundaries are, how they interact with VEP, and what they mean to you. So a PSAP boundary, and Annie and Breck, if I misspeak, please step on my toes, but a PSAP boundary does not matter to InDigital. I mean, excuse me, I would do that all the time. They're my two children. To DATAMARK. The PSAP boundary is something we deliver to InDigital for geo-routing. The way to think about a PSAP boundary is in a fully realized I3 environment with location-based routing, a call that is placed, the XY of that call will be delivered to a PSAP boundary, and it'll be point and polygon functionality to say, okay, we know that this district is in, or this call was placed in Madison County, it needs to go to Madison County. Or, you know, this call was placed in the city of Gadsden, and it needs to go to the Gadsden PSAP, not the Etowah County PSAP. DATAMARK doesn't do anything with the PSAP boundary. The provisional boundary is your area of GIS ownership, and it is the boundary that DATAMARK uses to run all of the VEP validation files. So they are separate but equal and do two completely different functions. InDigital does not care about the provisioning boundary, and DATAMARK does not care about the PSAP boundary. Now, they can be identical in footprint or completely separate in footprint. I know that there is an area in Winston and Walker County that I believe Winston County, air quotes, owns because of a lake and response boundaries. So they need those calls to go to Winston County. But Walker County is the GIS authority and runs validations off of that area in Walker County. So they do completely different things, and they are completely independent of each other. And DATAMARK cares about provisioning, and Digital cares about PSAP. PSAP is called delivery. Provisioning is GIS authority.
And Anderson, I do think it's important to note that the PSAP boundaries are local decisions. So those need to be negotiated and worked out, you know, among different localities. You know, you guys should be able to say, hey, this is where my call is routed as 911 authority. That's your responsibility, not just to accept, okay, this is my county boundary, that's good enough. That's not acceptable. You really need to review these in detail and make sure that where the boundary is reflecting where the calls should truly be routed. Because if you need to make an adjustment, that's something that you need to do with your neighbors, and that needs to be communicated to the state so they're aware that there's been a boundary change, because that needs to be reflected in VEP as well.
And to take it a step further, we're not drawing political jurisdictions. We're drawing boundaries of responsibility. So it could be your county boundary, or it could be something else. You know, the way to think about the two boundaries is PSAP boundary is for call delivery, the geo-routing boundary that InDigital will put in their functional core services and route off of. The provisioning boundary, while they're both sent to the VEP, the provisioning boundary is what DATAMARK takes and says, okay, run all these validations. Anything that lies outside this provisioning boundary is considered an anomaly because it shouldn't exist, because this is my area of authority. And while they can be identical, they can be completely separate.
all right. hopefully, Christy, that answered your question. Annie made a good statement in the chat as well. If we're
And we
good,
have, to be clear, we have modified the PSAPs that we have sent to InDigital. Coleman County has updated the Coleman boundary on multiple occasions to reflect annexations that incorporate the city of Coleman. So that's something is dynamic. It's not set in stone. We can send to InDigital and have a modified or an updated, for lack of a better term, PSAP boundary within the 72-hour mandated turnover window. It's a pretty easy modification. We just need notification, because we do not currently have a notification process about when you upload a new up-to-date PSAP boundary. We unfortunately currently need a notification that that boundary has been updated. So Kirsty says, I guess I'm talking about data being uploaded into VEP by DATAMARK that is not provisional boundary, MSAG and Alley. For those that are not aware, we are currently on a quarterly upload cycle to have a statewide refresh of MSAG and Alley. For those that send MSAG and Alley updates, changes, edits to InDigital, we have an automated process that sends that MSAG and Alley to your VEP from InDigital. There was I guess, mishap in Madison County where some Limestone and Jackson County MSAG and Alley information got onboarded into Madison County's VEP's MSAG and Alley. There's no spatial component to an MSAG and Alley, right? So there's an ESN and there's a county tag. And so where that data reflects an inaccuracy of another county, it's part of this process, this QA/QC, to say we are getting faulty data in an MSAG and Alley sent to VEP. I believe that happened in Pike County as well. Pike County was so there's there's a thing with leading zeros. If you have leading zeros in your ESN, we need to know about that. So part of the onboarding process in Pike County was the leading zeros were removed from the ESN, and it caused all kinds of problems. These are just growing pains we have to work through. But to answer Kirsty's question specifically, there was inaccurate data in the MSAG and Alley that we need to get modified. I guess at the interest of moving this forward, we're already at the 48 mark. We can move it forward, Becca.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the current InDigital remediation project. Anderson, you already kind of talked through the overall goals of this, but we did want to list them because, I mean, ultimately, the end goal here is to have your GIS data meeting the specifications to geospatially route calls. That is the goal, to get it fully functioning in that InDigital environment. And there's another component, which is synchronizing those legacy tables, the MSAG and Alley, with your NG911 GIS layers. So making sure they're all capturing the same information, the components of having that translation be represented in the GIS data, and ultimately with InDigital being the core services provider, they are responsible for providing certain values, which we are also making sure are populated in the appropriate layers. But again, the goal here is to have that data fully cleaned up and meeting the requirements to route calls geospatially. And I don't know, Anderson or Annie, if you guys want to add anything before I proceed.
So it's more than just geospatially call routing, which is important. It's all the things, all the core services that to date we have not done. And frankly, I don't know that's being done nationwide. I mean, I've heard California and Maine say they have ECRF and LVF functional. I don't live in those states, so I don't actually know, but we're we're cutting edge in Alabama. We are on the front of the 911 point, and we're building it as we go.
So I'm going to start talking through a little bit more of the technical details, the process, what you all can expect as we start kicking off these projects. So I'll go through the scope of work and the DATAMARK process as we coordinate with you all for these individual projects. So it's similar if you've worked with us in the past on how we manage remediation style projects, but we always do an upfront, data gathering and edit coordination discussion, because obviously we're gonna be in possession of the most up-to-date data. We want to make sure we don't disrupt any day-to-day, tasks, but we also need to work together to make sure that we both can meet our objectives through this project. So we always start with a conversation up front, getting that coordination determined, and then we will go into a full pass of anomalies that have been presented and that are included in this specific scope of work, which I'll talk through on the next couple slides. So we'll go through and clean those up. Now, after we get through what we call pass one, there's typically some items that fall out of that first phase that we need to engage and get authoritative decisions on, or just guidance from you all, because you guys know your ECD better than we do. So we want to make sure we engage you in that. That's where we'll have a discussion. We'll send over a list of items that need verification. And then with that, we'll get some answers, incorporate it, rerun those validations. That's where that iterative process comes in. And we'll go through and we'll resolve those anomalies presented through VEP that again relate to the InDigital contract. After that, once your data has been cleaned up and is in a really solid state, we have a process to ensure that the ESN and MSAG community values are appropriately populated in those GIS layers, and as well as the legacy information, and we perform our comparison at that point. So the comparison of the MSAG and ALI to the GIS data. And what's different here than maybe some previous projects is we're looking for full synchronization here, right? So if we've identified that there's a road center line not in your GIS layer, but present in your MSAG, we're going to make sure we add that into the data, make sure it's accurately attributed, and ultimately, again, making sure that the two data sets are capturing the same information. There may be some verification items that come out of this analysis as well that require ECD input. And then anything that is going to be an update that needs to be made on the InDigital side with those MSAG and ALI tables, we're going to send back to you all at the ECD level to go through that process and coordinate with InDigital to make sure that the tables are also getting updated as we are updating the GIS data. After we've done that, we will proceed into finalizing those deliverables, which I'll talk through, which will ultimately be your cleaned up GIS layers, some reports, and spreadsheets for your understanding. And then the final stage is we are going to refresh VEP, get it aggregated, and then get those deliverables sent over. So in a nutshell, that's the process we're looking at. Now let's talk about the requirements of InDigital and how they relate to the VEP validations and really what we're looking for that might differentiate from, other projects that you might have been a part of. So I have listed the specific VEP validation name, and what we are resolving through this project. So you can see the road centerline validations, a lot of range focused anomalies, and topology, which are those geometry type anomalies. Those will all be resolved. And then we have our road to boundary validation. So I want to be clear that this is only relating to the PSAP and provisioning boundaries. So we'll make sure that the roads are broken properly at boundary edges, fully contained, snapped appropriately to the adjacent roads along those boundaries. All of that will be included in this remediation effort.
So, Becca,
Yep.
Going back, there's still some discussion in the chat about boundaries. Lily from Limestone County said, I've never uploaded my provisioning boundary to VEP. I've been using the PSAP boundary to validate. Is that incorrect? So to clarify, provisioning boundary to validate and PSAP boundary to route calls, and both should be uploaded to VEP. So yes and no, right? So Lily, you actually did not historically, remember your hire date were not part of the onboarding of Limestone County into VEP. Every district was afforded the opportunity at onboarding to modify and or speak up about differing boundaries. Provisioning and boundaries for the vast majority of districts are going to be the exact same boundary. They're going to be coincidental. And they can be looked at as interchangeable in terms of geometric footprint. What the RCL to boundary validations is for the provisioning boundary, not the PSAP boundary. Scott said, I believe both PSAP and provisioning boundary are uploaded to DATAMARK, and that is correct, right? Like we said, give us your boundary. Is there anything that should be different between the two during the gap 1, gap 2? We're talking 3.5 years ago for some districts. And if they said yes, we talked through it. If they said no, and the thing to keep in mind is they can always be changed independent of each other and can be completely different boundaries based on the functionality of the two boundaries. But to drive the point home here, RCL to boundary validations is not run off the PSAP boundary. It is run off the provisioning boundary. Annie summed it up. Provisioning is basically a geofence that tells Next Generation Core Services where to route the call. PSAP is the actual call routing boundary.
Yeah, I misspoke. It's not where to route the call, but it's telling the NGCS like who's responsible. The provisioning boundary is a boundary of responsibility. It's saying, hey, I'm responsible for everything that's within this container, this boundary, but the PSAP is what's actually routing the call. Sorry about that. I'll see if I can.
And this is good feedback, and definitely needs to be a point of focus in the training that we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, Lillian, we've had some conversations because you have kind of a unique situation there in Limestone. But yes, if you have any follow-up questions, we're happy to talk specific project related items, making sure that you understand, what the decisions are, what kind of the ultimate outcome of that boundary is for you at Limestone. I know there's some data.
And Lily, Lily follows up and says, I wish I'd known to upload the provisioning 2 years ago. The PSAP, if you're maintaining an active boundary and in your mind that's been the PSAP boundary for 2 years, you can upload that to VEP as the provisioning boundary and instantly modify the boundary with which VEP sniffs these validations. So if you're an active maintainer of a boundary because of annexations or whatever the case may be, then we have a functional boundary to upload to the slot, for lack of a better term, in VEP for the provisioning boundary. The thing that needs to always be kept in mind is they serve two different functionalities, and where those functionalities have to be different because of real world circumstances, that's when the boundaries are not coincidental. I would tell you probably 80 to 82 of the 85 ECDs statewide, the boundaries will be identical. They just do two different things. So they live in two different spots.
Okay. Yeah, this is all great conversation, and we're going to talk a little bit about upcoming trainings at the end of this, which we will gather, continuously gather information that you guys are, the questions you're asking, and make sure that we include that in the content of the training. All right, to continue with the requirements of this contract and the anomalies we're going to be resolving, for the address points, we're going to make sure that, there's no address point that is finding a correlation with multiple roads. That one is directly rooted with a range overlap of a segment, but we'll make sure those are resolved. AP not reflected, so ensuring that the attribution is consistent across the two data sets, the address points and the roads. Also looking for where, an address point, house number might not be encompassed in a road range. So all of that will be considered. Duplicate point. So this one, well, I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, but AP duplicate point. So every point in your data set must be fully unique. So that could include, maintaining unit information. And then obviously, just like the roads, we need to make sure that the address points are fully encompassed in that PSAP and provisioning boundaries. So those are the focus of the address point validations. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm just going to keep going through, keep asking questions in the chat. The boundary related validations, again, the focus is the PSAP and provisioning. So if there's any gaps and overlaps in those boundaries that are identified, what's going to be, there are no spatial emergency service boundary adjustments that are going to be resolved through this specific contract. The focus is PSAP provisioning. However, all of the boundaries will receive the mandatory fields to being populated. And these ones specifically listed here are those values that are provided by InDigital, and we'll make sure they are fully populated in the GIS data. Right.
One thing to sidebar from the discrepancy IDs, for districts that actively maintain their GIS and participate in uploading, validating, and aggregating to the VP, a question we've gotten is, how do I populate these agency ID fields to bundle them all up? And the answer is we know what we think we want to have them populated as, but we don't know officially. Now that has changed as of, I think, the user conference. We found out, like, going down there, for those that are not aware, our web domain is the Alabama911board.com. We applied to the FCC to become a .gov and have been approved for that. So we now have a agency ID subdomain that we're actively working to create and file under FCC requirements so that we can give you that discrepancy agency ID.
So I see Scott has a question about the requirements. We could definitely PDF this PowerPoint and post that somewhere or send that out, right, Anderson? Distribute it.
Yes, we absolutely can. But Scott, to answer your question, I'll address that at the end. There's okay. A spot for that.
Okay. All right. So again, one of the big components of this effort are the MSAG and ALI synchronization with the GIS data. So these are the types of validations we're going to be working through, making sure, again, that anything that's not in the center lines that are represented in the MSAG are going to be created, and vice versa. That's where that report will be produced. If there needs to be feedback sent to InDigital, to make sure that the MSAG or ALI are updated, we're going to produce that through this effort. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but we're going to work with you to make sure that your ESN and MSAG community fields are fully populated. So fully populated and synchronized again with the MSAC and alley table. So that is a big effort. You know, it really varies based on whether you maintain an ESN boundary. We have our process internally where we can kind of work through that, making sure again that those values are captured in the GIS data. I guess I'll go back here and again mention that anything that we've identified that needs to be added into the GIS, DATAMARK will be performing. So it's not just a report out on, hey, you guys need to go through and do this. We're going to be making those additions on your behalf through this project. I just want to be very clear about that. Now, if you've had a kickoff with us already, we've already talked through these questions, but I'd like to give a little insight on, you know, when I said earlier about having an early coordination discussion, these are some of the questions we're going to be asking. So where the current data lives, right? Where should we be pulling the data to remediate for this project? We'll talk a little bit about what's in VEP versus what might be maintained locally. Coordinating the daily editing with the ECD, making sure that we're all on the same page on how that coordination effort's going to go. Getting access to the VEP instance. So we're going to be using the instance on your behalf, obviously running validations, uploading data, and then delivering at the very end with that finalized data set there through VEP and marking for aggregation. Now, I know that everyone uses VEP for sometimes different reasons, right? If your data lives in VEP, that's part of our coordination discussion. If you just use VEP as a, you know, more of the validator style workflow where you regularly, maybe once a month or every other week, upload to VEP, you know, we're going to work through that with you to make sure, again, that we have a seamless kind of transition for the duration of this project and how we're going to be temporarily managing this data. But we will request to have admin access. That way we can go through and we can do all the approvals. We can do all the root processes that we need to without kind of causing a delay in the project. So we talk a lot about schemas. Schemas are very important. We obviously want to be mindful of any other systems that are using this data. Again, one of the biggest pieces of the early setup of the project is doing a field mapping and a discussion, making sure that we understand the field you're maintaining, talk through any fields that need to be added into your schema to meet in digital and NG911 requirements, and just have that full discussion up front. And then we talk about the PSAP boundaries. So Anderson mentioned earlier about the statewide effort to create a seamless PSAP.
Becca, I think we lost your audio. So Annie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think I lost internet. I can share my screen though. Hang on.
Okay. Well, to touch on that specifically about the PSAP boundary, there's been a lot of discussion about that. So it's obviously kind of hyper-focused point, and I appreciate that this is very good discussion, and like I said, good feedback for the training and really diving deep into functional elements of both boundaries. But to answer specifically about the PSAP boundary and how this project will deal with that, again, if a district back in, I believe 2023 was our statewide boundary facilitation project, we invited districts to participate in a number of meetings where we could analyze the gaps and overlaps, which you will find in your cross-jurisdictional validations, not your individual validations. There are two separate validations, and one internally compares your validation to your provisioning boundary. One externally compares you to your neighbors where you have gaps and overlaps in the polygon boundaries, as well as road center lines and address points that go into somebody else's provisioning boundary. But where we had a participating district in the PSAP boundary remediation project, and we had a district that did not join or did not provide any feedback, we edge matched the non-participatory district. This is your opportunity to verify that your PSAT boundary is what you say it is, as well as engage in any kind of editing you want, or you thumbs it up and say, yep, the boundary that the state is currently geo-routing is the one that I'm happy with, and we are good to roll with that. This is your one of many opportunities, but an excellent opportunity to review and modify that boundary should you want to.
Okay. Can you
The
guys
other thing to think about is, we have 67 counties in this state, 85 ECDs. So there is a difference to me between an ECD and a PSAT. Emergency communication districts are our political jurisdiction through which the state board distributes funds. There are 67 counties, 85 ECDs, and 106 PSATs, public safety answering points. So Escambia County is one ECD, but has 6 PSATs that we directly deliver calls to over the engine network as a primary PSAT. Coleman County has 3 PSATs in that ECD. The vast majority of districts have a single ECD and a single PSAT, but there is a difference. And so it is an opportunity to not only edit your external boundaries with your collaborators, but if you have internal primary PSATs, to make sure that those PSAT boundaries are up to date to reflect the municipal PSATs within a county ECD.
Hey, Anderson, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you again, Becca.
Okay, I apologize.
No worries.
Thank you for covering the specifics of the PSAP. Yeah, that's definitely something we get answered up front, and I don't know what you guys heard because obviously I cut out, but that's a decision we need to have early on, because as you saw earlier in the slides, we do use a lot of we make a lot of modifications based on these boundaries to the other layers as well. So having that understood will help us remediate appropriately the other layers. The last question here, we ask for other supplemental boundary layers to help us with populating some of the requirements for InDigital. Obviously, if you have an ESN boundary, that'll help us populate the ESN field and potentially the MSI community fields in the data, and also understand the groupings there. Unincorporated community. So this one is actually an InDigital requirement in the GIS data that we're also taking care of. So the requirement is when the feature exists in an unincorporated part of the county, so not within a municipality boundary, the unincorporated community field must be populated in the data. So that's where we always like to ask again, do you have a boundary? It's pretty rare, but we like to ask anyway. And then if not, we'll work with you guys to understand how to populate that field throughout the project. But again, we like to ask for as much information up front to help us make informed decisions on this data. And if these are all discussions that'll happen at kickoff and in the early stages of our coordination effort. All right. Any questions about really the overall process, validations, coordination of the project to this point? All right. Annie, you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm sure you're wondering, what am I responsible for, and what can I expect to have to do through this project? So we've listed out high level the responsibilities of the ECD and then us at DATAMARK Technologies throughout the project. Obviously for the ECD, we need to have access to your current data so that we can begin the remediation. Engaging to provide authoritative guidance. I have a couple slides I'm going to talk about what that means, but we've kind of briefly touched on it, where there's going to be situations that we can't verify virtually, or we just need your authoritative guidance on, especially when it comes to boundary decisions. We're going to make sure we engage you throughout the project to get those answers so we can incorporate them into the data. Tracking edits throughout the project timeline, just making sure that we have an understanding. That way things can be synchronized. And then one of the biggest efforts here that we're going to talk about is how to maintain this data going forward, like following the delivery. So that way in the future, you know, this isn't a one and done, right? This is going to be a consistent feeding of updated data as you've added new addresses, new developments have been happening in your ECD. So part of what the training is going to cover, and that's why we're doing this, is really empowering you how to maintain this data and really understanding the specifics of meeting the requirements for this data. On the DATAMARK technology side, of course, we're going to remediate the data as defined in the scope of work that we just covered, and then make sure that we are engaging you all throughout the project, not only to understand what's going on, but to get those authoritative decisions and guidance as needed. And you can go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about what you can expect from when I say authoritative guidance. So I have some examples. So far, the common ones that we're seeing are relating to address verification. So whether that's a missing house number in the data that we can't verify with our resources, and we need some input if they're out of order, out of sequence. That's not as common, but it's definitely, if we can't, again, confirm what's going on, we're going to ask. And then we have been seeing features or points that are in the data, but not really representing any structure. So that can cause an issue, especially if they're missing attribution, making sure that we get input on those features as well. Duplicate address points. I have a screenshot I'll talk through on the next slide, but there's a lot of situations that, you know, the data is just not going to be readily available, you know, on Street View or on a parcel or something like that. And so sometimes we need to give that information back and have you all verify the point and maybe the update that needs made. Of course, this one, data being maintained out of PSAP or provisioning. This has been a pretty big one. And again, the goal here is to have a seamless data set, and you all understand, you know, what needs to be provisioned up to in digital, what is in your, what should be fully encompassed in those boundaries. And then, you know, I know that there's data sets that, you know, we have to provide our CAD provider because they reference, you know, roads that are in my neighboring counties. That's fine. That I know that there are caveats to this data, but as far as what actually is going to be provisioned and submitted to in digital, that's where those discussions come into play. And then MSAG and ALI related anomalies, verifying what the update should be, whether it's a GIS discrepancy or an MSAG discrepancy, sometimes just getting sign off on certain things like that. That's where we're going to seek guidance from you all. So on the next slide, I have some screenshots, examples. So this one, these two visuals are for data outside of the PSAP and provisioning boundary. On the left, you can see that the boundary, which is in like a light yellow, it kind of ends and doesn't encompass those address points in that road. We'll have that discussion and ask whether that provisioning boundary should be adjusted to encompass those features if they are really the features that are managed by the ECD and should be included in that boundary. And then on the right, it's a little more outside of the boundary, but you could see a few points that are relating to roads in the boundary layers, but the points are outside. So whether those should be included, and this is mostly talking about provisioning here when it comes to those single points, but I know that to the PSAP, if the PSAP needs adjusted, we'll have that discussion as well. But just asking the question, should these points be encompassed by those boundaries? Are you responsible for them? And do you answer the call for these addresses, these areas? So these, just some visuals to give you guys. The next one, next slide is just about address points. So we talked about duplicate address points. You can see here that there are 3 of the same address numbers, right? 176 County Road 250. So in this case, we might not be able to see on Street View the different, maybe they don't even have different house numbers, but they're actually different units. If that's not visible, or the resources that we have available, we can't make that determination on what needs updated, we're going to ask the ECD to verify that. There have been times where they need to be removed from the data set. And they're like, oh, those actually aren't real addresses. They don't, the main structure is this one, you can remove the other 2. These are the types of decisions that we're going to seek from you all, and talk through a proper resolution, because again, we cannot have these discrepancies in the data that we submit to InDigital. On the right, these screenshots represent missing information. So this middle one here just has points in the data set, but no attribution associated with it. They don't appear to be representing structures, right? So, but again, the aerial imagery could be maybe outdated. You never know. So we always like to ask, what was the intention of adding these? Or is it a future development? If so, if not, should they be removed? Do you have the information available? We'll talk through all that. And then on the right is just a missing house number. So if we can't determine what that structure number is, we'll request that information. And then once we receive any of these decisions, all of those answers will be incorporated into the data set by DATAMARK. So I just want to give you guys some visuals, because sometimes just talking about things, it's nice to put some visuals to the scenario. All right, now we could talk about the deliverables of the project. There are really 3 key deliverables that you're going to receive. The first one here is, of course, the GIS layers that have been remediated to meet those InDigital requirements. I have a couple sub-bullets here. Obviously, the data is going to contain the proper legacy attribution. So I've talked in length about the ESN and MSI community and the legacy street attributes. So if you're not currently maintaining those in the data, that is something we are going to take care of and make sure are properly formatted and maintained. And then the second component to that is ensuring the synchronization between the GIS and the MSAG and Alley tables. So they kind of go hand in hand, but that's where the addition of some identified records will be performed by DATAMARK. Part of the deliverable also is to refresh and aggregate that data within VEP. And then we always like to mention here that if there are unresolved anomalies in the data, well, first of all, no, there can't be discrepancies in the data we sent to InDigital. So there's got to be some sort of resolution. And sometimes if we can't get the answers in the duration of the project, any pending items will have to be exported out into individual layers for further review. And then that is going to be the responsibility of the ECD to work through at the end. So, and again, we'll talk to you about all this. This is just kind of a general note we put in here, but you'll be engaged throughout the project to understand what the next steps would be here. The second deliverable would be those recommended updates for the MSAG and Alley. So I discussed that anything that needs to be coordinated with InDigital will provide a list of what changes need to be made, and then that coordination effort will be passed back to the ECD to work through with the InDigital system and InDigital team. And then lastly, the report detailing the process that we performed for this project. Any authoritative decisions will be captured in that report as well, just to have documented, and then the results of the remediation and any next steps. So those are the 3 key deliverables of the project. Now, I'm going to pass it off to Annie to talk about the upcoming trainings that we're going to be hosting.
We are slated to come on site throughout the state, and the locations and dates are to be determined. But look for these probably, I would say, Anderson, are we going to try to get them done early in 2025? Or are we going to spread them out? What do you think?
Goals to spread them out. We initially had planned to do one the week of December 9th, but the entire board staff has conflicting obligations that week. So unfortunately, obviously, DATAMARK couldn't come first week of December, and we're not going to do it during the week of Christmas or New Year's. So we'll be punting to January 25th. Annie, I want you to go ahead and just finish up the agenda, and then if you guys are done with your slides, I have one more to show to talk about where we are and what our logic is behind the training.
Okay, yeah. So we are slated to be 10 on site throughout the state, and it's going to be 2-day trainings. So the first we're going to talk about, we're really going to step through the delivery, right? Like, here's your deliverable. Where do we go from here? So we're going to talk about, we're going to review those deliverables in detail. We're also going to talk about those data management workflows, like how do I maintain this, right? Because we want to maintain all of the really hard work that's been done to get the data where it is today. So we want to make sure that we continue that data quality, and that is very heavily relying on those workflows being in place. We're going to go through walking through uploading that data into VEP, running validations, downloading the validation results, those markups, and understanding what those mean, and then ongoing data management and maintenance workflows. And then the second day is really going to be more of individual consulting. It's kind of like the doctor's offices that we've had with you guys at the user conference, and like we did at the Alabama NINA conference last month. So it's really going to be more of individual consultation there. And we can walk through your own individual deliverables, or go through any personal questions that you have concerning VEP. So that's all I have, Anderson. Do you want me to stop sharing so you can take over?
Yeah, that works, Andy. Thank you. So I believe Kirsty asked where we are in the process. Can you guys see that map? Annie, am I properly sharing my screen?
Yes, you are.
Cool. So really the where we started with this project was if an ECD utilized NITA or DATAMARK under contract to modify, maintain, edit their GIS data. That's kind of where we started. And by default or by happenstance, that really meant a lot of the northern districts were involved in the project early. And so we kind of focused on trying to get the northern part of the state from maybe Jefferson County up in the first or initial round of the project kickoff. That said, that doesn't mean we can't go ahead and get you kicked off. The reason we did that is because of the on-site training. Made more sense to have it in areas where districts have been delivered or are close to having their projects or deliverables handed back to them. But if Covington County wants to jump on the project tomorrow, thumbs us up, let's go. We're willing to engage with any district. And I say all that to say, also training is open to anybody, however many times you want to come. VEP can be initially a little bit overwhelming. And if you've been to a VEP training and think, well, I've already been to training, I don't qualify or what. No. If you want to go to all 10 trainings, jump on all 10 trainings. This is open. This is a resource for you. And the other part of that is, like Annie mentioned, the first day is really all about VEP and how to interact with it. And the second day is for attendees to utilize it like a doctor's office to customize how they engage with VEP. So if you're gray on this map and want to get your data remediation project underway, reach out. We're all about that. And again, we will try to start in the north and move south and focus on early trainings in the north part of the state, middle 2025, the middle part of the state, and the end of 2025 at the end of the state. But I know Scott's an active participant in the GIS program goals. And Scott, if you're ready to kick off your remediation project, let's go for it. The other thing to keep in mind is this is voluntary. Like the engagement with this project is not mandatory. This is a free resource where you can leverage the 80 plus GIS analysts that DATAMARK and the Greater Michael Baker Corporation have at their resources. You don't have to utilize the resources. If you've got internal processes where you think that this is not something that work for you, what you do need to have done, and I was asked about the validation requirements, is have your data remediated by December 2025 to meet the in digital minimum data requirements, or you will not have your GIS data provisioned to the functional core services. In effect, you'll get left behind in the NG 911 process. So again, the genesis of this project was realizing how much work was there to be done, and not having an unfunded mandate. This project is offered to you guys at no cost to you. So that brings me to the modification agreement. It spells out, over 3 pages, what the requirements are, what the expectations are, what the deliverables are, and there is a dollar amount associated with that DataMark would, if y'all independently contracted with DATAMARK for these services, cost you guys. That is not a bill to you. That is just, it reads like a grant agreement, for lack of a better term, and just says that you either choose to accept this help and the responsibilities of incorporating the remediated data back into your production GIS data environment. Don't have to put it in your CAD, but it will be in your VEP, and it needs to be in your production data environment. Or you can decline the offer, and we have had a district say, we want to focus on doing this in-house, and my response to them was, awesome, fine, but let's don't decline it today. You've got till October or November of next year to really decline the agreement. But at some point, every district will either need to accept the offer of help or formally decline it and acknowledge that they will remediate to the digital standards in-house. So yeah, if you're gray on this map and want to get started, hit me up. So Scott says, we're trying to tackle these ourselves at this point. A checklist of what requirements need to be met by digital would be helpful for us to follow. It might also help to see if we need to take advantage of DATAMARK services, or if we are unable to tackle a category or categories. And that's the perfect way to look at this. We will send out the requirements. I can put that out on the GIS email, and then start working on those if you've got the resources in house to work on those. But don't decline the project outright. See how much of a bite it's going to be. And again, we can engage with you now, or summer of 2025, where it's looking like, oh, I've got in Scott's case 5,000 address points a week he's got to put out because of how fast Baldwin County's growing, and he doesn't have the bandwidth to tackle that project, and we can engage with you summer of next year. So the thing to keep in mind is the deadline for meeting these requirements is 14 months away. We're getting out in front of this early and offering a resource to help get you guys over the hump. And Annie brings up a good point. If you're interested in hosting a training in the new year and you have room for 20 plus people with desks, AV equipment, and Wi-Fi, that's kind of what the venue requirements are going to need to be. We're open to having anyone host. And there'll be more than one. Like we have 10 contracted trainings with Annie and Becca. So you're going to see a lot of them over the next year, which is awesome because they're awesome people. And, we'll do 2 or 3 in the northern part of the state, middle part of the state, southern part of the state, and probably have that last one somewhere where we feel like we can catch the last folks who have not participated in training, make it easy. The goal is to have at least one training within an hour's drive of every district in the state. And those that are not monitoring the chat, Annie said you should have had one in December because they in digital. I mean, excuse me, DATAMARK is the gift. Well, it's been an hour and a half, and part of that is because of really good discussion in the chat, which I really appreciate. But I would say Annie and Becca, unless you've got anything else, it is 11:30 in the great state of Alabama and getting very close to lunchtime.
I just want to say I appreciate you all so much. We will have another virtual session, Anderson. I don't know. We need to talk about that whenever we're going to have that, and it's basically just going to be a one. So
Annie, your audio is cutting out pretty bad, but what I did hear was we will have another one of these for those that attended. You're welcome to come back, but really the focus and scope of this modified Talk About It Tuesday is to introduce the concepts of the digital minimum data requirements, what the project is, and the resources being offered. And we encourage anyone to always attend and participate with everything the board office does, but it will be a repeat of what this presentation was. Cool. Annie, Becca, any last parting words of wisdom?
No, just thank you for the participation, and we look forward to supporting you all.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And again, feel free, please reach out to me if you're ready to get your remediation project underway.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.